So once upon a time, Major Kwek of the Singaporean Army was assigned to the national headquarters as a young planner with no training and found himself among a professional cadre who were responsible for maintaining, training, manning, and equipping the conscript army that had been satisfactorily managing the traditional threats that Singapore faced when accounting for environmental factors, a current strategy that was stable, and a recent update of useful and achievable national goals and visions. And so for decades, that conscript army and professional cadre had been satisfactorily handling the national defense. And then things changed. The traditional threat had begun to morph and was becoming what seemed to be at least a hybrid threat, but there were some other uncertainties about the domains of space, cyber, chem, nuke, bio, terror, nano, diplomatic, information, economic, political challenges that suddenly gave concern that the conscript army with professional cadre could no longer satisfactorily manage national defense. And it wasn't clear how much time there would be, but there seemed to be some. And so the research question was, how should Singapore respond to this evolving threat? How should Major Kwek fill in that gap with a design for a force that could handle the threat as it emerged and during the transition periods to that new uncertain future? So he decided to apply the professional case study method in the following way with some guidance. We started with the chief decision maker in mind, the chief of staff of the Singaporean Army and the Minister of Defense, who would make the policy changes and coordinate the political support needed to provide the economic and diplomatic and informational and social support to make these kinds of potentially dramatic policy decisions. And to persuade those chief decision makers, we needed a professional case study so that we could carefully define the boundaries of the problem space and use professional standards of reasoning, evidence, and decision making to be persuasive to those decision makers. And it would be an applied professional case study because we were going to use those tools in the manner designed in order to be persuasive. We weren't trying to alter those fundamental processes unless we could prove that we needed to do so. So we began with a strategic estimate to be creating a rich description of the present and potential future in a systematic, disciplined way that allowed us to look at the terrain, the enemy, and ourselves. And that was appropriate because this was strategic level. If we'd been looking at tactical threats and requirements, maybe we'd have used an IPB and seen the terrain, seen the enemy, and seen ourselves, but the strategic estimate seemed to be a nice way to proceed. The problem with it is that it doesn't lead you to a particular course of action or recommendations, but it does document a rich database of knowledge and relationships upon which you can build a deeper sense of analysis. And so we decided to then adopt a Army design methodology approach because this looked like a wicked problem and we needed to apply some creative and critical thinking to achieve at least a semi-structured problem and environmental frame so that we could proceed with more detailed planning. And in that model, you need a rich description of the current state and then the future state. And then why don't you just go to the future state? Because of the problems that are there. And then you try to maneuver through your limited environmental frame to find an operational approach that allows you to get to the future state while accounting for defeating, bypassing, reducing, isolating, destroying, or maybe leveraging the problems as they emerge in the surface and then perhaps at the causal problem or root cause level. And once you find an operational approach that seems to account for the known and knowable problems, then you can say that this round of design thinking is done, and you can give initial planning guidance for a more detailed, rigorous approach to rational planning, such as an MDMP, military decision-making process. Until such time as you have an operational approach that seems like it would work, you're still going back through this iterative problem and operational approach dance, and you might have to expand the boundaries of the environmental frame to give yourself room to maneuver, or add more resources, or change the nature of the future state in order to achieve success within your area of operations. And the strategic estimate then seems like a way to feed into those descriptions of the current state and some elements of the problem area and some of your resource areas as well. But we need more detail, and so we then move to conduct a capabilities-based assessment in the force management domain, which consists of a functional area assessment, functional needs assessment, and functional solutions assessment. The functional area assessment looks an awful lot, almost identical to the description of the current state of or where we are. And where we want to go looks a lot like the functional needs assessment that tells us what the requirements are, the capabilities that could help us achieve that future state in the face of the problem. And a functional solutions assessment really combines both the problem frame and the operational approach in order to come up with the range of possible solutions, which then we try to express in the next model, or a .NO PF model, for gap analysis, solutions analysis, needs development, solution recommendations in each of the domains of doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, personnel, facilities, and policy. And then this gets us to the level of detail where we can begin to get actual recommendations made. And we realize, of course, that the environmental frame we're working with is complicated by other dynamics like changing allies, roles and opinions and positions of neutrals in a morphing threat. So this really is a dynamic movie that we're creating, and it's not really a snapshot. It's bodies and ideas in motion and in time. And so time now becomes an important component of how we assess the dynamics of this entire operation. And we got to remember that as we're going through these iterations, that things like the environment, the current strategy, national goals and vision, and the threat are all morphing. So there's a real sense of a dynamic ride here. So as we look at the development of Major Kwek's thinking, we might call R1 his pre-research position, in which he hadn't gone through that skill set yet. And this was what he would recommend today before he did any research. But after he'd gone through analysis and several iterations, he might arrive at an R2 position, or his updated personal recommendation as a function of his take and his judgment on that analysis. So is he ready to go to the chief decision maker? Not quite yet, because that wise leader will say, who's affected by those things that you propose? And let's do a stakeholder analysis in order to ensure that it's really suitable, feasible, and acceptable to those stakeholders. So we picked a representative sample of three or four stakeholders and identified who they were and what their mission was, and the roles and responsibilities that they had, and their authorities and their values and the preferences they had in these areas, and then how they might vote on that package of proposals. And we use those critical thinking, multi-perspective insights to improve the R2 positions to an R3, or improve professional recommendation. And then we could finally brief the chief decision maker, who, it wouldn't surprise me if he said, you know, Major Kwek, you're so awesome that I am now going to hire you to implement this plan, put it into action. So show me your campaign plan, because I'm certain that you've thought your way through that. And so by developing a campaign plan that included a short-term, 0 to 2 years, a long-term, 2 to 5 years, and priority tasks, A, B, and C, that A were must do, B were should do, and C were nice to do, we could now arrange those mission essential tasks in something like a project management chart on a calendar with sequences and insurance and redundancy and resourcing levels and in-progress reviews, in such a way that we could develop a transition plan in a military manner that could allow us to turn that package into an integrated solution in the force. we know there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. And so, at least in the F100 paper, what we're going to do is apply these principles of force management to our portion of some problem that is connected to a larger strategic initiative or a driver, to learn how we go from the plan to approval and then into implementation and integration. So we'll explore that. Major Kwek's position, working at the strategic level, because we wanted to minimize the risk of having just a military point of view, we had an opportunity to add academic rigor to his work. And so not just using military models, but we took a look at things like best practices from the civilian and academic community, and considered the paper from Courtney and his co-authors from Harvard Business Review on managing uncertainty from 1994, which provides a great framework to understand what kind of a problem do you have, and therefore what kind of a solution should you be looking for, and what kinds of postures can you adopt based on the level of uncertainty and your strength and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and then what portfolio of actions might you put together in order to respond, given the answers to those first two questions. And this gives us a good strategic framework to categorize choices and estimate the value and robustness of different choices. And when you take this kind of model plus the model that comes out of CBA, you might have some triangulation going on and give yourself the benefit of both practical professional reasoning and academic rigor to get a best of breed approach. And then you might also use a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, in order to further refine some insights that might be found in the .mil PF recommendations. And it helps us look at how we turn facts and assumptions into a risk and reward model that leads to properly resourced and understood opportunities and courses of action that give us favorable positions. So we're not gambling, but we are taking prudent risk. And then to further the probability of successful implementation of that transformation plan, we might compare it to the 8-step Cotter change model, which is a process that can improve the success rate of transformation projects, as proven over time. And then if we use that to help inform the detailed plan, we might again get the best of both worlds. And so then if we were using this in a MMAS master's thesis, we might take a look at these various artifacts and processes and models and map those to the standard 5 chapters of the MMAS to locate each of those artifacts and intermediate steps of analysis and decision making into either the introductory chapter or the lit review chapter to make sure we defined how all these terms and models are being applied. We might use then chapter 3 to describe the recipe of this workflow that I've just described so that others might duplicate the work or adapt it for their own use. And in chapter 4 is where Major Kwek reported his R2 personal recommendation for .mil PF solutions, and then the R3 final recommendations that were modified and improved as a result of stakeholder lens analysis. And then chapter 5, he described his implementation plan, future research questions that were suggested that were beyond the limits of his study but we could see needed to be addressed. And then a personal learning reflection that talked about how he might have developed his own personal judgment and learning insights and self-awareness as a result of going through this year-long process of both the MMAS and then the interface with faculty and peers, and then the application of the whole academic year from CGSC into a nice tidy package. And that might have been so well received at home that next year's Singaporean officer might have come here and been told to continue to refine and develop this as a practical way to address strategic planning and implementation in a holistic way. So for our purposes in F100, this should give you some sense of how we go from strategic requirements to figure out what the capabilities and needs are and how we might use a disciplined process to come up with targeted solutions that are sensible, that are satisfy the stakeholders, that are suitable, feasible, acceptable, and could get the buy-in from chief decision makers, and then with an idea of how we might develop an implementation plan that is both robust and adaptive and effective at achieving the end state that we imagined when we first started doing the design thinking. So that's what we think about the top-down view of force management and how it relates to practical problem solving at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. So thank you so much for your kind attention, and keep marching. This is Dr. Long at Delro at CGSC. We'd be interested in your comments.